Ladies and gentlemen, it is July the 7th, 2024, and we are here to talk about the world. Foreign policy, economics, history, you name it, we'll discuss it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
Oh, hey. How are you?
Solid, sire. How are you doing?
I can't complain.
Good. Well, yesterday, just so you all know, I was drunk, but not so drunk that I'm hungover today. So it was a good time. And I didn't do anything that I regret. That's also good. I also didn't operate any motor vehicles or pregnant machinery. And that's important too. Stay safe.
What kind of machinery?
It's a joke about you're not supposed to drink while pregnant, and you're also not supposed to operate heavy machinery while pregnant, which means you're definitely not supposed to operate heavy pregnant machinery. That's doubly illegal.
Understood.
Yeah. Yep, my solo honor mode run is making progress. I've been playing more of that since the subathon ended, so I've had the space to stream more of what I want instead of trying to knock out the different goals that were unlocked. So it's like, I want to play this, deal with it. And that was nice. Basically, in the Gauntlet of Shar right now, I think I'm level 8. We just completed the trials today. The sneaky one, the jumpy one, the self-same, which I learned from that one. If you pre-buff a character and then walk in, it will like generate the copies of your other characters as well because their buffs impacted the fight. So I had to go tell the rest of my party to go in. I thought you could just like haste and bless one person and send them in and they could be haste blessed against a normal target, but no. It brought in the other characters because they were influenced by others apparently.
All of them?
Yeah, all of them spawned in. So I had to just like walk the rest of the characters in after the fight started.
Did you try just not walking anybody else into the room preceding the trial?
I think they were in that room where you drop the blood or whatever.
Yeah.
And then signal that you're going to start it. I left them there. So
Yeah.
maybe if you send them to the room out of that, they wouldn't spawn?
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Oh, okay. No, I did not send them back that far. That might be the move.
Yeah, I've had the same problem before. I thought I could do what you kind of did, where you just send in one person, but the whole team ended up spawning.
Yeah.
So I think they have to be completely outside that whole area.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know you can do it just by sending in one person, and then they just have to fight themselves.
Yeah.
So that should be doable. I'm just not entirely sure how.
Yeah, I think the safest bet to make sure you know that they won't spawn in the fight is to just jump 3 of them off into a chasm and they'll just be dead, and then you can walk in and they're for sure not going to spawn in. That does cost you 600 gold though to res them at Withers.
Yeah, it's expensive.
Mm-hmm. I did have to flee one fight that I was in day before yesterday. There are, I think it's a group of maybe 7 Githyanki that are near the road to Baldur's Gate. It's kind of meant to be a deterrence to trying to go that direction before Act 2 is done. And I had to flee that fight. I think one of my characters died and the rest of the characters escaped. And then we reset and then actually got into the fight again accidentally because they didn't go back to their initial spot. They were just there whenever I left camp. I was like, oh shit. So immediately in combat, and then another person died. I had to flee again, but each fight we killed maybe 1 to 2 of them. So I was still chipping away at it and was able to, by the 3rd try, beat them, and I ended up leveling up from that because I was level 7 against level 9s. That fight is hard.
Yeah.
Just randomly level 9s there.
Yeah, you gotta level up. You gotta level up a bit for that one.
Mm-hmm.
It also helps if you approach from the side rather than along the road.
Yes, I walk down the road and it's all low ground. It sucks. It's like, oh, they have this bridge and they're all high ground up there. That's like an archer's dream. We're giving them the best fight that they could get.
Yeah. The last time I did it, I approached from the side, so I actually had the high ground on them.
Ah, smart. Yeah, you're good at positioning. I would say that's one of your strengths that I've noticed as a player is you don't really allow yourself to get into an ugly spot just by looking at the spots before you go in and be like, I think I'm going to do this. I tend to sometimes just walk around assuming I'm immortal, not care, and then be like, oh shit, that's a very strong fight. I didn't realize.
Well, I assure you that I've learned the hard way.
Yeah.
Especially in PG3. Most of the things I do right now because I did them wrong the first time.
True. Experience is a very good teacher. And the main reason it's such a good teacher is pain. It really hurts more to make the mistake yourself than it does to see someone else make it, even if you consider yourself very empathetic.
Have you ever gotten the blood of a Lathander?
I don't know. What is that from?
That's in the Githyanki Kresh.
Uh-huh. What do you have to do for that?
It's a whole puzzle thing you have to do, and then it's a whole... If you haven't done it before, we'll definitely try it.
Mm-hmm.
Once we get to that part of the game, if we survive that long.
Sure.
But yeah, there's one of the puzzles involved in that I don't think in any of my runs I've remembered how to do correctly. I always forget, and I end up getting flung over a cliff to my death.
Oh, no.
So even experience can fail you if you don't remember.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how about your other runs? How are they going?
Other run, we didn't have an opportunity to meet this past week, but we are level 12, so we're, I think, quite close to endgame. We can pretty much fight anything now, and we're making the last few changes to our talent builds and who gets what item and stuff, just to make sure we show up with maximum strength to the fight. It's
Nice.
crazy strong playing in our 4 stack because 2 of the players have completed the story, I think, on Tactician. So they have quite a bit of experience, and then the other player aside from me is our dungeon master for our D&D campaign that we've been doing for like 3 or 4 years. We're basically on hiatus now, just because we haven't had the time to do a session, but as the dungeon master, he knows the game at a pretty deep level. He's playing just a pure fighter, and he probably deals the most damage of any of us, just level 12 fighter. He's been a fighter the whole time. It just slaps really hard.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, it's crazy seeing how if you have the full effort of a person with each character, it's pretty different from trying to manage 4 characters independently. And then the speed that you can go through the story is quite a bit faster because of the shared turns mechanic. You can play physically faster with a multiplayer run than a single player run because you can take turns at the same time. So pretty cool. It's been
Sounds like it.
rather fun. Yeah.
So you're further along in that run than you are in your individual run?
Yes.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, it just recently passed my furthest ever tactician progress.
Oh, nice. And what was that?
That was a ranger. My first tactician character modeled after Drow Ranger from Dota 2.
How far did you get?
To Act 3, I hadn't killed any of the stone people aside from Ketheric Thorm. But they were kind of vying for my attention.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you should enjoy it then, because you're just getting started in Act 3, it looks like.
Yeah. Well, I don't really know how far Act 3 goes, but I'm assuming we're pretty new to it. I assume level 12 meant we were close to it ending, but I guess you just don't really level up more for the last bit.
Well, I mean, it depends, right? Because if you've got really experienced guys, then they can play the game such that you get level 12 relatively early. So depending on your choices, it's very easy to get to Act 3, or even relatively deep in Act 3 without hitting 12. Again, just depending on your decisions.
Yeah, I could see if you took a lot of conversation routes or stuff where you're outsmarting people and out-talking them, and you don't kill as much stuff, it's definitely giving you less XP if you just play the murder route.
Yeah, Act 3 is... I mean, Act 3 is the one that really is more of the choose-your-own-adventure style, because Act 2 definitely had, like, a narrative, and then Act 1 had a narrative, but allowed some exploration, but in Act 3, there's a whole shit ton of side quests. So if you do all of the content in Act 3, it's longer than the first 2 acts combined.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So you've got a long way to go yet, if that's what you want to do. Or you could just blitz to the end.
Yeah.
Given that you're already level 12, you could probably do that.
Right, yeah. So it's kind of like in Skyrim, you can choose whether you further the main quest or side quests, and you could basically triple your playtime if you did the side quest first.
Yeah.
Cool, makes sense.
But there's a lot of end-game stuff, like equipment and weapons, that you can only get if you do the side stuff, so you'll probably end up doing at least some of that. Because some of it's really good. All the end-game stuff is in Act 3. All of the best in-game stuff, anyway.
Cool. Well, Baldur's Gate, great video game. In addition, Dota's been pretty funny. I have a lot of StarCraft passion right now, too, so gaming is good. World-wise, as an American, I feel more embarrassed than ever. I would say that's a downside. Yeah, I'm trying to find the positive, and the positive to me is like, okay, who are we looking to throw our support behind in the next election cycle? Because I feel like it's somewhat of a blunder for us as normal people, and obviously we don't have full power of the country as normal citizens, but to feel very not represented right now is interesting. I feel like for previous elections, there were at least more reasons why the person could seem forgivable as a candidate. Like in Biden's first run, he was a lot more coherent for the way that he was able to keep up in the debate and stuff, and it seemed like Trump was the fool who was stumbling into him and he could just laugh at him. And now it's kind of like the opposite seemed to happen, at least in the public perception. So for people who are left-leaning, you don't really feel good about throwing your support behind someone who's not really together at this point. So no one's going into this feeling that good. And I feel like Trump has, with his crimes and so on and just his conduct, there are some fans that he may have had in the first run that he lost at this point, or at least along the way. So yeah, kind of icky sticky for what we have to choose from. Who could we look at for the next cycle? Like, what's the new blood?
Nobody knows.
Okay.
That's wide open. A lot of people that might have thought about running did not do so because Biden was running again, and on the right because Trump was running again. So we don't necessarily have a great idea of what that would look like. There were some people that did. On the right you had Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis, but DeSantis ended up just kind of imploding. And Nikki Haley was always kind of more the establishment candidate, even though she actually worked in the Trump administration. And so she kind of alienated a lot of the core Trump supporters. So it's not really clear if either of them really have that much of a future. I imagine there's going to be more Trumpy, so to speak, type people that will run in Trump's stead once he finally does step down. But there's a similar dynamic on the left, too. There's just been a chilling effect, so to speak, on a lot of would-be candidates. So it's kind of hard to tell who would run. I don't know. I'm sure that both parties would prefer more of a centrist candidate, but that's not really where the passion is with the base.
Yeah. You want someone to be really galvanizing some of the needs of people and some of the things that they're talking about and wanting.
Yeah.
Like on the pulse of America, so to speak. I feel like Bernie Sanders definitely hit a demographic of people. He didn't win, but he definitely fired up a lot of people who felt like he was the kind of candidate they wanted, and he had more of that issues-based breakdown of this is what the American people need, and he's like actually yelling about stuff that people do genuinely need. So they felt like, hey, we're seen by this politician, and they're kind of about our interests. With Hillary, she was similar to Biden, I think, in being the lower risk, more vanilla establishment candidate who is going to do the political speech the politicians are supposed to do and basically stay in their lane. But they lack personality and definition of someone who's going to revolutionize something or change something big with their role. And it's really hard to have someone who's about major change that doesn't create too many enemies in the process. Because if your change is too radical and too extreme, you're not going to get enough people who are into it who want to make that happen. So pretty interesting meta in trying to win office.
Yeah, it's a difficult balancing act. I mean, in general, polling suggests that people have been drifting away from the center towards the fringes. So it may be that we're just kind of destined to end up with the politics of a far left versus a far right candidate. And that it just comes down to who can generate the higher turnout amongst their core constituents. And that would not really augur well for political stability, because what will happen is that one candidate will win the presidency, if not also Congress, and then there will be big swings in policy. And then the other group will come in, and then they'll just undo everything the previous group did, and then institute their own radical changes. And then policy will just whipsaw between them over time. And there probably will not be much of substance done as a result. So that could be what we have to look forward to. That is one possible future. But on the plus side, the candidates in that case would indeed be very exciting. People would get their wish. They would have interesting, exciting candidates to choose from.
Here's to hoping the future has some better options for us. There were people talking about UK and French elections.
Yeah, that was the big news the past week.
What happened?
The French had the second round of their parliamentary voting, and then the UK just had their election. Results were pretty much in favor of the center-left in both cases. In Britain's case, the Labour Party won a clear-cut victory. They picked up a huge number of seats. I think they have, I don't remember exactly, it was something like 400 plus. It was quite a bit. So the Conservatives are definitely out of power. I think Keir Starmer is already Prime Minister and is already running his new administration. They have much faster turnaround in British politics than we do here in the US. You know, they'll have an election over the course of like a month, and then the results of the election result in a change of government in the week or two after. So very fast, very different from the US. Yeah, Labour won mostly because the Conservatives just kind of bungled their 14-some years in power. People were just tired of them. They just had no faith in their ability to run the country anymore. And Labour, for its part, kind of took advantage of that as best they could by trying to move towards the center and pick up the disaffected Conservative voters who had turned on the Tories. Keir Starmer is very much like the avatar of sort of center-left politics. You know, he's a former human rights lawyer. He's been in politics for a while, so, you know, he's an operator, right? He's an experienced politician by this point. So he's not like the exciting candidate like Jeremy Corbyn was back in the day. Well, I say back in the day, it was just a couple of years ago. But the Labour Party really cannot accredit its victory to like a victory of its ideas. Really, actually, the data point that I kind of noticed is that the incoming Labour government, actually I guess sitting government by this point, won the lowest proportion of the vote of any party that won a majority and came to power in the history of Britain. They only won about 33% of the vote. And they were able to translate that into power because Britain has a first-past-the-post system where districts vote for representatives in the parliament. So it's not a proportional voting system. So you can have radical differences between how many people vote for given parties and how many seats that those parties end up winning, because the country does the first past the post system. So in this case, Labour did not really appreciably increase its proportion of the vote, but because so many people in so many districts turned on the Conservatives, they were able to capitalize on that and turn that into a major swing in terms of control of Parliament. So yes, they won power by a large margin, but if you look at the actual voting proportions, people are not that much more excited about Labour than they are of the Conservatives. So to a degree, this is a kind of hollow victory. Like, yes, they have pushed the conservatives out and there's an opportunity for something new to happen. But at the same time, it seems like expectations are pretty low. And I haven't really seen much evidence that the center left in either the UK or France, or really just the broader Western world, has any better answers to pressing questions and policy issues than the center right has had. Probably better than what the populists have. A lot of that is low-hanging fruit. Well, not even low-hanging fruit, just bullshit most of the time. But that doesn't mean they're going to be able to solve anything. We're not really looking at substantive change happening now that there's been a change in government in the UK. They're going to struggle with the same issues with Britain's economic problems as previous governments have. Low productivity, low investment, difficulties with wages, temp work, all that kind of stuff is going to be just as big an issue going forward, probably. None of that is easy to solve. It requires difficult trade-offs that really nobody on any side of the political spectrum in the UK or in pretty much any other developed country wants to make. And that means that there's kind of a policy deadlock where things kind of just continuously get worse, kind of regardless of who people vote for. And that will likely continue to be the case so long as there's no major trade-offs that the voting body politic is willing to make, towards either the left or right. Both left and right have solutions, but they come with trade-offs that are generally unpopular with a critical mass of the body politic, such that they can't really be implemented. So as a result, things are just kind of stuck, uncomfortably so for many people. But yeah, other than that, Nigel Farage's party, Reform, did relatively well. Again, because of the first past the post system, they were not able to leverage that into very many seats. I think they only won a handful of seats, according to the exit polling that I saw the last time I checked. But that's not bad, for a relatively new party. Liberal Democrats, which in Britain are basically like libertarians, the pro-business party, they picked up several dozen seats. They did pretty well. So they went from around 12 to around 70 seats. Pretty decent showing for them. And then the Scottish National Party lost around 8 seats. So kind of a weak showing for them, relatively speaking. So all told, dramatic change in Parliament, but the underlying calculus in British politics in terms of voters and voter sentiment probably hasn't changed all that much. So we'll see what Labour can do. Maybe they can actually turn things around, but I don't think anybody is all that optimistic at this point. So we'll see. So that's the UK, and then France is actually pretty much the same. A lot of people are pretty excited because the left wing, well, I should say far left mostly, coalition called France Unbowed. I'm not sure what that is in French. They were able to win a surprise victory. Polling had been suggesting that the National Rally, sort of the far-right party, would win more seats than anybody else, but that they would not have a majority. And instead, they won the third most number of seats, with France Unbowed winning the most, and then Macron's party, I think it's called Renaissance, winning the second most. So a surprisingly poor showing there for National Rally. So that had a lot of people excited, especially on the left in France. But the pollsters were right that nobody would win a majority. So whoever wants to control Parliament and eventually appoint a prime minister, they're going to have to make a coalition with somebody. And it's not clear how that's going to happen, or really if it can happen. Because effectively, France Unbowed and Renaissance have kind of said that they don't want a coalition with each other. And given that they, rule out a coalition of any kind with the far right in the form of National Rally, basically all of the major actors in Parliament hate each other and are not willing to cooperate. So that does not augur well for the future stability of the legislature there. We'll see what they do with it. I think I did read that Macron was going to try to peel off some of the parties that are a part of the France Unbowed coalition. I think they mentioned Greens and then maybe Socialists. But I'm not sure if that's going to work. because from what I read, I also read that the coalition, the France Unbowed coalition, is hanging together for the moment, and that they're going to try to get into power as a group and not split up. So that's all kind of an open question right now. Keep in mind that France has a semi-presidential system, which means that power is divided between the president and the prime minister. It's not like the United States, where the president has like full unified executive authority, or even like the UK, where there's kind of a unified legislative slash executive branch. In France, it's kind of informal, but basically the president controls foreign policy and the military, and then the prime minister controls domestic policy and economic policy. Roughly speaking, that's how it breaks down. So, Macron can kind of do what he wants to a degree in foreign policy and defense, but whoever comes to power and takes the prime minister's office, they're going to have sweeping powers in other areas, which is, basically most of French politics. So it'll be important, whoever manages to negotiate a coalition. But given the compromises that will have to be made to make all these disparate political actors come together, they're probably not going to be able to do anything of substance, would be my guess. And that's going to make it very difficult for them a couple years from now, when the next elections come up, to argue that this is a workable solution. Whatever coalition is cobbled together. I suspect what Macron was kind of hoping for was that National Rally would do well enough, but not well enough to get a lot of seats, but not well enough to get a majority, so that they would be in a position where they would have to negotiate with somebody else to form a coalition. And then he could either negotiate with, that is to say, his party could negotiate with the far left, and do that from a position of strength, or they could negotiate something with National Rally, and then maybe put them in a position where they would have to compromise and moderate, whereupon they could lose some support to the center because they were seen as compromising their position, or they could basically just be blamed in a couple years during the next election for being unwilling to compromise, and then in turn being an obstructionist force in French politics. So as is, that's not going to happen. Instead, it's probably going to be some kind of weird coalition between Renaissance and France Unbowed, or elements thereof. And that's probably not going to be any more stable, but it does leave the door open for National Rally to blame whatever dysfunction results on the establishment parties, on Renaissance and France Unbowed, and then possibly to make ground later, since they'll be able to argue from the position of opposition that they're the only real alternative to that dysfunction, and that anybody dissatisfied with the status quo should vote for them. So Macron's gamble did not blow up in his face entirely, but I don't think it really worked according to what he had intended either. So we'll see in a couple years how things kind of pan out. But for now, there's just a lot of uncertainty.
Chat saying they remembered a month or so ago when they expected the far right was going to win France.
Yeah, there was an expectation that they would do pretty well. That's what I was reading too. So the polling suggested as much. What polling couldn't really entirely predict, though, was all of the strategic voting that happened, as well as the coordination between Renaissance and France Unbowed. There was no active alliance between them, but in district, they have a first past the post system in France too. So in a lot of districts where Renaissance or France Unbowed was the second or third ranked in the first round of voting, they would pull out of that vote so that the vote could consolidate around the anti-National Rally candidate, whoever that may be. So that allowed a consolidation of votes towards alternatives to National Rally. And that was done in a way that was effective enough to basically keep National Rally in third place in terms of seats in the legislature. And voters, of course, also participated. Again, strategic voting meant that people voted for parties that they didn't necessarily like, but wanted to vote for to ensure the National Rally did not pick up more seats, or at least inhibited the number of seats that they gained. Yeah, France has a long tradition of doing that to keep the far right out of power. The cordon sanitaire, as I've heard it described. So that's still in place. That's still a potent force in French politics. But we'll see if they can hold out. The next couple of years will be telling in that regard. So all told, as far as elections in France and the UK, 2 victories for anti-populist forces, you could say. But they could prove to be pretty fleeting victories, depending on how the new governments shape up and govern over their respective terms. So we'll see if this ends up being a hollow victory or a substantive one in a few years' time.
Cool. Chat saying, thank goodness we don't need an Orban in France.
Well, don't count your chickens yet. It's not over. This is a populist era of Western politics, and it's nowhere near being over, most likely. I still think if we can kind of navigate it without everything kind of imploding, then it could be for the best, in so much as it moves political parties and their governance closer to what the broader part of different countries' body politics actually want out of their governments. Since for a long time, there was a lot of stagnation and inactivity in governments, and a lot of problems were just kind of left unresolved. So if we can make it through this, I think we'll end up with stronger, more representative governments that implement policies that have more popularity and are more impactful at dealing with various policy problems. But you have to get there first. And that's, it's going to be like a 10, 20-year transition. And we're not even 10 years through it yet. So there's a long way to go yet. Well, was there anything else you wanted to get to?
I didn't see any major news stuff that stood out to me this week. Aside from that, I didn't browse a ton. But U.S. media is just all presidential election for us right now. There's a...
Well, did you
Go ahead.
know that Iran was having an election?
I did not know that.
Yeah, you remember their president died in that helicopter crash, right? Yeah, so they're having the election now to see who replaces him. And kind of like France, they have a first round and a second round, with the second round being the runoff. And in the first round of voting, which they've already had, the reformist candidate actually did really well, surprisingly so. Keep in mind, you have to put an asterisk next to reformist, because in Iran, they have an institution called the Guardian Council, which is responsible for vetting candidates that run for office. And they don't really let anybody who's an actual substantive reformist run for office. You have to be pretty much loyal to the regime and loyal to Khomeini, the Ayatollah, if you want to be able to run. So you don't really have any true opposition candidates running. But, there's a spectrum, right? So there's relatively hardline, relatively reformist. And so amongst the candidates that were allowed to run for president, the one who was the most reformist on the spectrum of politics did relatively well, kind of over-delivered, so to speak. So going into the second round, there's a real chance he could win. And, the things he's been talking about are encouraging. He says that he wants to resume engagement with the West. He wants to shift away from China a little bit, wants to try to get the nuclear deal back in place. He sounds quite moderate. And if he's being honest, that would augur pretty well for relations with the West and the United States in particular. It would be pretty ironic or funny, or maybe tragic, depending on how you think about it. But he could win at the same time that Trump gets a second term. And if that happens, then you would basically be seeing the governments flip on both sides. So right now, Iran's government is pretty hawkish, but they stand to have a change in government that could result in a relatively dovish moderate. relatively get into power at the same time that the United States would be flipping from a relatively dovish candidate to a relatively hawkish candidate. President, I should say, not candidate. So, we're just sort of constantly wrong, at the wrong place at the wrong time politically, as far as relations between the United States and Iran. If we ever both were led by dovish leaders at the same time, maybe progress could be made, but that hasn't really happened much over the past 20, 30 years. I would also point out that voter turnout in the Iranian election was very low, about 40%, and that was something the Iranian government was hoping to kind of address in the lead up to the election. They really wanted the turnout to be relatively good because they consider that a signifier of the regime's legitimacy.
Yeah, the more people you have vote for the election makes them seem like they care relatively more than other ones.
Yeah. So didn't work. Turnout relatively low. A lot of people don't think it's really worth the effort since they don't really have an actual choice in terms of who the leadership is and what the core policies of that new government will be. I think turnout in the British election was relatively low as well. I don't think I mentioned that before, but we've talked about 3 elections now, and all of them had low turnout and are relatively low consequences as far as substantive change in the future. Make of that what you will. Oh, did we talk about the mass protests in Kenya at all?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. And the government tried to raise taxes, and people flipped the fuck out. Hit the streets, and so the government had to climb down and announce that they were going to walk them back. Part of the issue isn't just taxes. Part of the issue is what the taxes were being raised to pay for, and a lot of that was basically debt. What I read, the statistic that I have in my notes here is that Kenya now spends 61% of all its tax revenue on debt service. In other words, paying the interest on loans, which is very high. More than half of all of your national budget going just to bankers would probably be upsetting to just about anybody in any country.
Mm-hmm.
So therein lies the issue.
Why a lot of people like that for them?
Because they borrowed a lot of money.
Mm.
They took on a lot of debt to invest in infrastructure, to cover expenses like social welfare, other things, just typical stuff, patronage projects, what have you. I'm not super up on Kenyan politics, so I can't get too much into the details. But everything I've read suggests that it's just prototypical stuff. COVID, for example, required pretty much every country on Earth to borrow a bunch of money. Mm-hmm. So, the usual assortment of items that lead countries to go into debt are at play with Kenya. I don't think there's any one specific thing that can be pointed to as a vanity project or something that just bankrupted them. Like, say, the 2004 Olympics, for example. Mm-hmm. Not to rag on the Greeks too much, but that was probably pretty unnecessary in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, I think they wanted theirs to be super important because Athens was where the Olympics started, so it should be the best Olympics ever.
Well, that and Greek politics is pretty thoroughly corrupt, and it was a good opportunity to kind of spread the wealth around.
Oh, do they get to keep some of the money?
I mean, when politics and politicians are corrupt, then invariably, whenever the government spends money, a decent chunk of it ends up in the wrong pockets. Hmm. And a lot of money was spent on the Olympics in 2004, so you can probably guess who's benefiting from that. Hmm. But that's why people in Kenya were upset. They didn't want all that money just going to bankers when, there was a lot of pressing problems in Kenya that they could have been spending the money on. Mm-hmm. But of course, the trade-off is that the fact that the government has trouble raising taxes to meet its obligations as far as debt, means that lenders will be less willing to lend to Kenya in future, which means that if anybody does want to lend to Kenya in future, they're only going to do it at a much higher interest rate, which, somewhat ironically is going to make the debt servicing problem even worse in future. Yeah, it's a difficult balancing act for any government to try to balance the interests of capital, especially if you're a small country, because you don't really have any control over capital markets, much less so than if you're a large country like the United States or maybe the European Union, for example. Smaller countries are very much at the beck and call of international lenders in many cases. And, if you do displease those lenders, then you could be in dire financial straits because they just won't lend to you if they don't trust you, or if you do a bunch of shit that they just think means that you're not going to be able to generate the economic growth necessary to generate the tax revenue necessary to pay them back eventually. So balancing their interests, the interest of the lenders, with political perceptions amongst voters who tend to be very anti-capital, that's very, very difficult. And that's been the bane of many a government in the developing world.
Grifters be grifting, indeed.
What else did we have here? Israel blew somebody up. Not unusual for them.
Status quo.
Yeah. Senior Hezbollah figure. Hezbollah responded by firing a couple hundred rockets into northern Israel. And so then Israel retaliated by blowing up some Hezbollah infrastructure in southern Lebanon. It sounds bad. I guess it is bad. People are dying, but this is what you might call controlled carnage, right? It's largely performative. Like neither Hezbollah or the Netanyahu administration are really interested in a war right now. That doesn't really benefit either side. So the result is that they're kind of nipping at each other to try to show that they're serious, but at the same time, they're making sure not to escalate too much so that they can avoid actually having to do something of substance. The real fighting is still happening in Gaza for the most part. If and when that eventually dies down, then presumably a lot of the skirmishing going on with Hezbollah and then also with the Yemenis, the Houthis down south, presumably those will also end. But who's to say? That's a guess. And it certainly doesn't seem like the fighting in Gaza is any closer to any kind of definitive end. So more likely there's going to be a lot more skirmishing for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, there is a headline like every 2 days of someone accepting a ceasefire deal. But as you said, both sides have to agree to the same one for it to matter.
Yeah.
I think it was this time, Hamas agreed to a U.S. ceasefire deal. Soon it'll be Israel agrees to someone else's ceasefire deal. But fundamentally speaking, they would need to propose some alternative to violence, which nothing sounds better than violence to the people who are really going at this conflict.
Yeah, no structural changes there in the trajectory. Yeah, there's a lot of things that are just kind of on trend, so I don't really have a whole lot to report. The Geneva conference didn't really go anywhere with Ukraine. Putin gave gave an offer in terms of what he would need in order to start peace talks, which was basically that Ukraine withdraws from the provinces that Russia claims and has technically annexed. And they also have to forswear joining NATO, and also sanctions have to end. And then the Russian government would be willing to talk about a potential peace deal. So they may not even agree to a peace deal. The fighting could just resume after that. So, that's a pretty raw deal if you're Ukrainian. I don't think they're going to take them up on that.
Yeah. More performative politics.
Did I tell you about the prison island that Honduras is building?
It sounds familiar.
Well, it's kind of similar to what El Salvador has been doing, right? Where they just build a huge ass prison and then dump a bunch of people who are suspected of having gang affiliations into them.
What?
Oh yeah, we've talked about Bukele before. Coolest dictator in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was how he dealt with the crime problem in El Salvador. Anybody who's even suspected of being a gang member can be arrested and imprisoned. So that makes it very easy to arrest. And, to be fair, it's not hard to tell who's a gang member because they all have tattoos by which they identify their gang affiliation. So, if you've got MS-13 tattooed on your face, you might just be a member of MS-13.
Yeah, I would say that evidence would point toward being a member.
Yeah. So, you don't need to be a master detective to figure that out.
Yeah.
So they were able to basically just arrest anybody with gang tattoos using the emergency powers that Bukele implemented, and then they just dumped them into this giant super prison that they built specifically for that purpose. And the result was a dramatic fall in crime. I think the murder rate got to be lower than in Canada.
Wow.
When it had been like one of the highest on the planet.
Wow.
So it's been a massive turnaround, and it's been notable. Like, you can just tell the people who live there anyway report that the change has been dramatic and is notable. So they credit the government with that.
Mm-hmm.
So other governments in Central America are kind of toying with the idea. I don't think Honduras is going so far as to declare emergency powers or anything like that, but they are building a similar supermax prison, in their case, like on an island off their coast, that's going to be able to hold, 2,000 capacity, which is a lot for a small country, right? Let's see. Oh, and the Honduran Defense Council demanded that Congress change the penal code to allow authorities to detain suspected gang leaders without filing charges, and also carry out mass trials as they do for alleged terrorists. So that was a request. That's not a policy, but the fact that they're talking in those terms at all does, again, show that people in the region are looking more and more favorably on the Bukele model. Oh, I also have in my notes here that the Honduran government in 2022 had already imposed a state of emergency to combat bloodshed and suspended part of the Constitution. So they're kind of on that path. They haven't actually done it yet. Crime is still pretty bad in Honduras, but they're getting there. I would point out, too, that Honduras's president is a left-wing reformist president who won power despite the fact that the powers that be really, really didn't want her there. They fought very hard to make sure that she did not assume the presidency after she won. I think her name is Castro, am I remembering correctly? I remember I couldn't pronounce her first name. It was like Zia Model.
Oh, with like X's and stuff?
Yeah. Ximena Castro, is that right? Actually, let me just look up President of Honduras. Xiomara Castro. Okay. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing it.
So being tough on crime, jailing anyone with a gang tattoo seems like to be a pretty bold strategy. But if the gangs are identifying themselves and making it very easy, that seems like a easy layup.
Yeah. Yeah, the issue, though, is that some people get into the gang because they're forced into the gang and they don't have a lot of choice. And there's also suspicion, although it hasn't necessarily been proven yet to my knowledge, but there's suspicion that the police are going to use this authority corruptly, that they're going to abuse the authority to extract bribes, and, other favors. Basically, when you suspend rule of law, there are things you can do that are useful, but if you maintain it in place, then it ceases to be emergency powers and just becomes powers. It becomes the new status quo. And without rule of law, then there's not really anything stopping the government itself from becoming as criminal as the gangs it pretenses to fight. So therein lay the trade-off. And I haven't seen much evidence that people like Bukele are going to give up these powers anytime soon. He himself really seems like he wants to stick around. So people may be all for it right now, but that's because the symptoms of a permanent authoritarian dictatorship have not really become apparent, because they generally only become apparent well after the early benefits have been accrued. Probably 5 to 10 years it'll roughly take before people start realizing that the government is unaccountable and they no longer have any mechanism to hold them to account. That's more where the problems really start. But they got a ways to go to get there. So for now, they're still in the honeymoon period. Oh, do you remember Bald and Bankrupt? I think I recommended his YouTube channel to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I hadn't been to his channel like in months, in a long time, so I hadn't really seen what he'd been up to. He actually went to the Darian Gap, which kind of blew my mind. Yeah, are you familiar with the Darian Gap?
No. What is that?
That's like, are you familiar with the Pan American Highway?
That sounds familiar. Yeah, the Darian Gap is the super dense jungle, right? That you can't go through on a normal road.
Yeah,
okay.
In Panama. Yeah. So, the Pan American Highway runs like all the way from Canada down to the southern Chile. But it's not continuous because of the Darian Gap. They couldn't build the road, or wouldn't build the road through that part of Panama. So you have to like get on a ferry or something. And then when you get to the other side, then you can get back on the road and go all the way down. So it's very undeveloped, it's very wild, and there's not a lot of government authority there. It's mostly like natives and, natives, gangs, and cartels, pretty much. So a lot of the people who are being trafficked or who are trying to migrate anyway to the U.S. border, they'll go through the Darian Gap on foot and then walk up through Mexico to the U.S. border. Well, they'll walk up after they pass the Darian Gap, they'll walk through Central America and then through Mexico and then to the U.S. border. So that route is pretty famous by now, and there's lots of stories about all the terrible things that happen to people who walk that route trying to get to the U.S. And Bald and Bankrupt and one of his friends apparently decided to just do that. Like, not just the Darian Gap, they started in Colombia and then they just walked the whole same route that the migrants were using all the way to the U.S. border.
Damn.
Yeah, I was impressed. I mean, that was pretty ballin'. That's an extremely dangerous route. And, especially being relatively well-off guys from, like, well-off countries. I think his friend was from Greece, and he himself is British. So, like, they could have easily been kidnapped, especially in the Darian Gap, because it's known as being the most, one of the most dangerous parts of the trip. I think they also said that the train in Mexico that they take, the Beast, is also very dangerous, because so many cartels will prey on the migrants on the train whenever it stops. There was one guy that said that was actually more dangerous than the Darian Gap, specifically for that reason. But the Darian Gap itself was pretty harrowing for them. They almost didn't make it. They did an interview after they finished the whole thing, after they finished filming all of it, the whole trip. And they said that in retrospect, they had done a terrible, piss-poor job of doing research and preparing. And they even said it was, like, explicitly stupid that they did that. Like, they were so poorly prepared. They didn't buy, like, boots, for hiking. They just went, like, in regular sneakers. They didn't really buy much, if any, food. They barely had enough water. I think most of the water they bought, like, just before they went. Like, even the supplies they had while they were traveling, they mostly just bought because this guy saw they were about to go without supplies and said, hey, you're going to need some stuff or you're going to die out there.
Don't you guys want supplies? And they're like, yeah, I guess we should have supplies. That's a good idea.
Yeah, they bought a tent for like children, like a child's tent, so it was like a size too small. So whenever they tried to sleep in it, their feet were sticking out. Like, it was goofy. But they got a lot of really good footage. Like, if you want to see from on the ground, right, like point of view footage of what migrants are going through traveling up from South America through Central America and through Mexico, definitely check out that series. It's like 3 or 4 vids. They're all relatively long, but yeah, it's well worth the watch. It really gives you a good idea of what that trip is actually like and how difficult it really is.
Interesting. What were the geographical features in that part of the Darian Gap that made them not want to go through? Just too dense of jungle, or like rivers or rocks, or what is it?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the deal was with the Pan American Highway. It might have just been expense. They may have just figured it would be cheaper. Some of that is national park, I think, like a reservation for natives. So there may have been a problem there, negotiating rights. Like technically speaking, I'm sure it would have been feasible if they'd like really wanted to and had tried to force it.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know the details. Like the real answer is I don't know. But it's definitely pretty thick jungle. So it would definitely be work trying to build anything through it. I did have a note on Ecuador in here too, related to migration. So one of the ways that Chinese migrants trying to get to the U.S. border use is a route through Ecuador. Because I think last year Ecuador actually reached an agreement with China wherein Chinese travelers could come to Ecuador visa-free.
Mm-hmm.
And that was meant to just improve business, improve travel, and improve people-to-people ties, students, that kind of thing. And instead, a whole shit ton of would-be migrants just used it so they could get their foot on the ground in South America and use Ecuador as a starting point for their migration north to the U.S. border. So the Ecuadorian government didn't really like that. Probably more like the U.S. government didn't like it and pressured them to do something about it. So a month or two ago, the Ecuadorian government did announce that they were going to suspend the visa-free policy. Yeah, their estimate was that as much as 50% of Chinese visitors coming to Ecuador were just coming as migrants and not because they wanted to actually visit Ecuador.
Ecuador uses the dollar, right?
Yes, they do. Yeah, Ecuador, Panama, El Salvador, possibly Argentina soon, depending on how well Malay manages to navigate Argentine politics. I think those are the only ones that I can recall off the top of my head.
Quick Google search of why the Darian Gap is so scuffed. Dense rainforests, steep mountains, muddy swamplands, turbulent rivers, dangerous wildlife, and high levels of humidity and precipitation.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it's some gnarly jungle.
Zimbabwe doesn't use the dollar. I looked up countries using US dollar and it's listing US territories. Well, why would it do that? All right, so the actual independent countries on here: Panama, El Salvador, Ecuador, and for some reason Zimbabwe and Somalia are listed. I don't think Google knows what it's talking about. I mean, it's true that Somalia and Zimbabwe are basically failed states and that their economies are garbage and in those cases, black markets kind of default to the US dollar. So in that sense, yeah, you could say the US dollar is dominant there. But you can't say it's like the official currency in those places, like it is in El Salvador or Panama. So that's kind of apples and oranges.
It's interesting. It would make it pretty convenient as a tourist, I guess. If you just go there and you don't really need to change money. Saves you a couple steps. Has anyone in chat been to any of those countries? Oh, Dagnip is here.
Oh, hey.
Dagnip says, there's no fucking way Malay is able to do what he says. It was already known from the elections it was unachievable BS.
Yeah, Dagnip's not a Malay fan.
Okay.
I've learned that. I did email him.
Oh, nice.
I did email him, so he's probably been busy. I think I also emailed, finally, King Riku with a response to his request. He wanted me to watch a video by some German dude who was going off about Ukraine.
What was this dude's take?
America is an empire, and it wanted to expand to Ukraine, and so it engineered the conflict between Ukraine and Russia by organizing a coup at Euromaidan in 2014. All part of a grand plan.
Seems like it's
So
a lot
I sat
of big
through.
steps.
Yeah, so I sat through an hour of that. It was a long video, and I tried to just kind of comment on different things that he talked about. It wasn't just Ukraine, but it was mostly about Ukraine. But he touched on a lot of other sort of talking points that are relevant, peripheral to that. So I wrote like 30 pages.
What?
Stuff.
Okay, wow. He was thorough.
Well, I mean, if you want me to watch an hour-long video and then to comment on it, then there's going to be a lot to comment on, especially when somebody's saying a bunch of crazy shit.
Yeah.
Well, not even crazy shit. The trouble with guys like Ganser, who's the guy in the video, is that he's a genuinely smart guy, and he knows how to present information in an objective way without actually being objective. He's very clearly being very subjective. His analysis is weak. There's a lot of biases and logical fallacies at play. But trying to kind of elaborate that stuff is difficult, right? It's a lot harder to disprove something than it is to, well, assert something. And Ganser asserts a whole bunch of shit in that video. And so I try to kind of disprove some of the more egregious things. And again, it's not falsities that are the problem, it's half-truths, it's misrepresentations. Those are a lot harder to convince people of, because the things they talk about in that vein are kind of true, sound true, are based in some truth, but then are used to try to rationalize or justify something that cannot be rationalized or justified using that information. So that's kind of the intellectual sleight of hand at play there.
Gotcha.
And it just takes 30 pages of bullshit, basically, to even begin to kind of address it. So it took me about a month and a half to write all that.
Well, props for doing it. Appreciate you breaking that down. It can be tedious, but it can also be really enlightening for a person to kind of see everything addressed with respect. It made me think of Terrence Howard, the actor, who fancied himself someone who's reinventing math and science with his genius, and stating that a lot of the long-term scientific theories of many different things are wrong, and he knows the answers to fix them. And this is really bold shit to be saying as a scientist. Like, you are smarter than Isaac Newton and Tesla and a bunch of other people all at the same time, and they got it all wrong, but you know how it is. Like, that's pretty big potatoes. So Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's probably the most foremost public intellectual of scientists, who's willing to be on TV and shit, he went through Terrence Howard's entire document and responded to everything. And it was kind of like you're saying it, but I think it was more like 80 pages or something
Yeah.
just addressing every single thing that's in the whole document. And he did give him credit for some things that seemed like beautiful ideas, but would require a lot of replication of different experiments to prove them. Whereas, like you're saying in this video, it's pretty easy to assert stuff quickly and just say that stuff is the case. It takes more effort to put that to the test and prove why it's true or not. A lot of people just, they have the assertion and then they choose not to listen to other people trying to test it and refute it, which is intellectual dishonesty.
Yeah.
But if you know big words and you have a degree, a lot of people will trust you by argument from authority.
Yeah. Therein lies the problem.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's maybe a little easier for him to kind of do that because his audience is mostly German. Like the whole video was in German. I had to rely on subtitles.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think some of the things he talked about are maybe less incendiary, maybe in a German context than an American context.
Mm-hmm.
Like saying that JFK was assassinated as part of a government plot because he wasn't going hard enough on the communists. For an American, that's an obvious conspiracy theory. Certainly there's people here who believe that, but I think even they would admit that it's perceived as a conspiracy theory. Mm-hmm. And then saying that the government was responsible for 9/11 is an obvious red flag unto itself.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think most people in Germany would probably also recognize those as conspiracy theories and red flags, but maybe they have a different reaction than people here in the US. Maybe we've got some Germans in chat who can kind of comment on that, but certainly listening to Ganser say that stuff, my immediate thought was, oh, this guy's a bullshitter.
Mm-hmm.
Like, do people take this seriously? I mean, it's hard. Again, even when there's red flags like that, like if you try to break it down and explain why they're wrong about that stuff, it just takes way more energy than it took them to just put it out there on the internet. So it's a labor-intensive project responding to people like that.
Yeah.
Which I think is why it doesn't happen as much. Maybe not as much as it should.
A lot of times, it's kind of like the dankness of memes. The sauciness of a take can be a major factor in how much it's passed along by other people. Because if you have something that's very controversial and spicy, you get a lot of people talking about it. Because if it's true, that's pretty crazy. A lot of normal, boring stuff, it doesn't really take as well in terms of passing it along. It's like, actually, no, it's the normal, boring reason. Like, who's going to tell their friends that the normal, boring shit ended up happening? They want to share the spicy, saucy stuff. So for these sorts of rumors, they survive longer in the telephone game sometimes, because it's a more interesting and spicy idea, more people are likely to share it with others and prioritize that as part of what they talk about that day. But you do need to put your ideas to the test and weigh the evidence of stuff. But even for smart people, this is the thing that I think people who fancy themselves smart, maybe because they got good grades in school or something, or they got a high IQ test or whatever, they'll assume that their intuition is going to lead them on the right track. But that's not a good assumption to work from because a lot of people are getting false information. So every single person should be skeptical of what other people are claiming, and you should be very aware of the difference between a claim and just some raw evidence for what it is. Because normally people who are taking an hour to make these videos where they have some crazy take on stuff, they're making a lot of claims, and if you were being a really diligent listener, you would want to understand what's the difference between the claims he's making versus the fact on the ground. That can be a difficult assessment to make, especially when it's a really complicated topic and you've got an expert talking about it to non-experts. Usually experts within experts, they can talk back at them because they know all the logical fallacies and stuff that are happening. They know where you're kind of reaching for evidence and you don't have it yourself. Whereas for your layperson who's not in that science, you can sometimes miss whenever they're taking those shortcuts or they're skipping steps in their logic and they're making claims that sound really good because that person has a big vocabulary and a fancy degree on the wall, but it could be complete horseshit. And there are many very genius scientists and people in their field who have done great work, as soon as they start talking about stuff that's well outside of their field, they're basically a normal person again. But a lot of people don't think about it that way. They think, oh, they're still the super scientist. So I think, who's the guy? Jordan Peterson. He's pretty famous for talking about many, many different things.
Yeah.
And he is a rather decorated psychology professor. So he has made some ground there. And when he's talking directly about psychology, he does have good things to say and valuable things to say for sure. But he talks a lot about lifestyle and society and these huge big picture things where you're making such a broad take on stuff that you can't really be that accurate. It's definitely kind of shooting from the hip. This is just my opinion here. This isn't really science. So for these kind of longer form videos, when you do have someone who's in that role of argument from authority, you do have to, as the more ignorant person, say, okay, this is a claim. Maybe it's true. I can use this as something I know could be true. I need to gather more evidence to see where the truth leads me.
Well put. Inference in establishing causality. These are very challenging things to do. And it takes a lot of practice, and even with a lot of practice, it's easy to fall into logical fallacies and other potholes along the path to knowledge. I don't begrudge people for struggling with it. Even professionals struggle with it. But it definitely does create some problems, especially when people aren't even really trying.
Chad was asking some about Supreme Court. Was there any new information there?
I think there was a ruling regarding presidential immunity.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we talked about that. Are you familiar with that?
No. What's that?
So basically, there was a case. I think this was the Fulton County case. I think it stemmed from that. Basically, the idea was then President Trump could not be tried, for allegedly interfering with an election because of quote unquote presidential immunity. And the Constitution is kind of ambiguous about presidential immunity. It doesn't really say much. So some people interpret that to mean that there is no presidential immunity. And then other people say that you can infer presidential immunity from other immunities that are granted to other offices. Mm-hmm. And, some of the smartasses online kind of noted that, the conservative court that likes to interpret the Constitution literally from an originalist perspective actually kind of ruled that there is presidential immunity, despite the fact that there is nothing that can be read in the Constitution that can be interpreted from an originalist literal perspective to grant that immunity. So this seems less like an originalist interpretation here that says that there is broad presidential immunity than something that stems out of kind of an old conservative canard from the 70s. The Nixon administration got in a lot of trouble over, Watergate, among many other things. And so there was a lot of discussion at the time about whether or not he could be criminally brought to trial, prosecuted. Mm-hmm. And, his administration's argument is that when the president does it, it's legal, which of course set off a lot of alarm bells in the legal community and in civil society. So they said broad immunity, opposition said no, and the courts kind of punted on it, but eventually said that there's a kind of gray area. There are some things it's immune for, some things it's not. And the recent court ruling basically establishes that there is broad sweeping presidential immunity, so long as it's done, that is to say, so long as the action done in question was done in his official capacity as president. And they established two further categories, one of which is actions that are kind of peripheral to presidential responsibilities, and then other actions that are done in a personal capacity. Actions done in a personal capacity can be prosecuted. Those done in a presidential or in a capacity that's peripheral to presidential responsibility, those are immune.
So it's more so, how presidential are you going about your business? if you do stuff in a very presidential manner, of course, you're allowed to do whatever you want.
Well, it's not the way it's done. It's with regard to the job.
Yeah,
right?
job description stuff. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, if it's, I mean, the issue there, though, is that you can kind of describe anything in terms of presidential responsibility. Because the problem with the Supreme Court's ruling is that they left it ambiguous just what the boundaries were between these three categories. So it's going to be relatively easy for a future president to argue something was done done in his capacity as president when really it wasn't, or to argue that something that was done in his capacity as president was not done, was rather done in his own personal capacity. So that's going to create problems for the future because of that ambiguity. And, I kind of understand the argumentation behind the Supreme Court's ruling, because their concern is that there's going to be political rivals to the president, any president, not just like a conservative president or a liberal president. The issue they're concerned about is that political rivals will bring frivolous, arbitrary cases to bear against a president, just to either incapacitate him, distract him, inconvenience him, or to otherwise chill him, to otherwise establish a chilling effect on his ability and practice of the presidency. And that could result in the president not doing things that he should or could do as president that would benefit the country, or that would otherwise be necessary for a president to do to fulfill his duty. So there's a kind of fear of hyper-partisan hackery sabotaging the executive that is kind of behind that ruling. And so, there is that. Like, if you did make it just fully legal to sue the president over perceived illegal action of whatever kind, that could result in an avalanche of lawsuits, some of which could be substantive, but a lot of which would just be frivolous, and again, just done to try to scare the president into not doing something. So some immunity makes sense. I don't think anybody argues that there should be no immunity. The issue here, again, then, is that there's too much immunity, and that what areas that the president could be convicted of, could be prosecuted on, have really ambiguous boundaries that are just not clear. So that's where the concern is. So we'll see. Some people are saying this is like going to make it legal for a president to assassinate a political rival. And that's kind of true, but the issue there is that presidential immunity and whether or not you could prosecute a president for something like that has always been ambiguous. And there's never really been a substantial precedent set in that regard, because every president recognized that there were norms in place that they needed to follow, specifically to avoid putting the political system in a position where it would have to make that kind of judgment. And, there are some judgments that are just inherently going to be divisive and destabilizing. And, this is obviously one of them. So presidents across American history did the Republic a service by just making sure to avoid that. They didn't do things that were illegal, or if they did them ambiguously enough that they didn't end up in court, right? They did us the service of breaking the law discreetly. And Trump does not do that. He does not recognize that norm. And the result is that he's introduced this crack in the foundation of the system that is going to be very difficult to address. It's basically impossible to address without pissing off large swaths of the population, which again is exactly why every previous president specifically avoided that. Like, this is just the kind of structural flaw that is inherently difficult to fix. Inherently difficult to address. And so, it's one of those problems that's just best left sort of in the shadows. Like, don't deal with it as much as possible. But Trump just blundered right into that. So now we have to deal with it. And again, there's just not really a good solution in the Supreme Court, for their own reasons. I think, one, because they think, for their own reasons, has ruled that there is broad immunity. And I think they did so for two reasons. One, the reason I already elaborated, they're concerned about hyperpartisanship sabotaging the executive. Another reason is I think they believe, and I think this is kind of an established argument in sort of the more originalist circles, originalist legal circles, that the real punishment for any crime committed by a sitting president or a former president well, a sitting president, should be impeachment. That to them is the main punishment. The trouble there is, of course, that that's only as substantive a punishment as politicians in Congress can be trusted to impartially judge and impose it. And I think the two impeachment cases that Trump went through suggests that there's pretty limited interest in doing that in Congress. So the Supreme Court may have faith in impeachment as a mechanism to police the behavior of a president, but the trouble is that pretty much nobody else in American society shares that faith. And that's resulted in a massive amount of hand-wringing in the United States and in American legal circles about the significance of the Supreme Court's ruling on this. So I don't think a president could actually murder a leading opposition figure without consequence. But what that consequence would be is unclear. It could just be a slap on the wrist. It could be impeachment. It could even be later prosecution by a future president that maybe just doesn't observe the Supreme Court's ruling here. So, I mean, I don't know. You could go in any number of directions, pretty much all of which are banana republic territory. Again, the way that you deal with this is to just make sure it never becomes an issue in the first place. So we've already crossed the Rubicon on that. So whatever happens now is going to be just bad and ugly. The real solution to this is to vote politicians into office who actually do understand the importance of political norms, the ones that are necessary and substantive in maintaining the integrity of the republic, right? That's an inherent part of any system, right? I've said it before on here. We've talked at length and years ago when Trump was elected, and talking about him was more a common question, right? You can design a system that is optimal. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how well you design the political system. If the people responsible for running it want to fuck it up or abuse their power or otherwise sabotage it, then it's going to fail. And then the flip side is also true. Like, even a relatively poorly designed political system can work, can at least function, if the people responsible for running it actually make an earnest effort to run it and avoid the pitfalls and other, flaws in that system, avoid exploiting the flaws in that system for their own personal benefit. So that's kind of where we are. We have a decently designed political system here in the United States, but more and more officers of government of one kind or another are more and more interested in exploiting the flaws in that system rather than judiciously avoiding and managing them, generally out of their own benefit. And that's not an easy problem to solve. That just comes down to political culture and the voters. If voters want to vote people in that want to burn the system down, then there's not much you can do to stop them. Like, it's a representative government. If those are the voters you have, then the government you're going to end up with is going to reflect that. So good luck putting out those fires.
Thank you. I wish people peace and compassion in trying to comprehend the opinions of others. People have their opinions and they hold them very strongly. Stay safe and keep trying your best, chat. One thing that's really interesting is regurgitation as a method of expressing one's political orientation, mainly just kind of copy-paste quoting what you hear other people on TV say. That's not really thinking about the issue for yourself. It's the laziest position, but a position that a lot of people take because it's the least effort, mentally speaking, to just kind of go with what the news is saying about things. But know that, as we've said here, every news source has a bias. And if you're confirming your own bias, you're not really learning anything new. You're kind of being pandered to in a way that they're trying to make you feel smart, correct, and right in the end. So the more that we can respect, like, good politicians, in quotation marks, of individuals who are trying their best to just do the job, the more likely we are to be represented by reasonable adults.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's difficult to navigate the media landscape in an era where media is so desperate for revenue that they're willing to kind of cater more and more to the loudest and most dramatic actors. But that's another structural problem that's just inherently hard to solve. How do you put those responsible for producing information in a stable enough financial footing that they don't feel they have to do it like that? So they kind of tried to do that in the UK with the BBC. You know, they kind of have relatively secure funding, but then the result is pretty much the same. Like, broad swaths of the public there don't trust the BBC because they think it's institutionally liberal or leftist, so to speak, and think that it's biased against them. So, you know, how do you deal with that? Like, if the media is perceived as left-leaning regardless of whether it's controlled by the government or not, like, what's the solution then? So, you know, we're kind of in the era of difficult problems without easy solutions. And mainstream political parties and politicians have struggled correspondingly to deliver results on those. And rather than recognizing that the problem is inherently complex and is not likely to be solved in a satisfying manner, people are turning to alternatives that pretend that they can solve the problem when really they can't. So, you know, that's kind of the era we have to navigate. That's what I meant before when I said that, you know, we have to get through this first. You know, if we are just stuck with parties that constantly lie to the people and misrepresent their achievements and manage to hold on to power by doing so, then that pretty much breaks the game. You know, that pretty much is going to be a long-term problem that will be very difficult to recover from. But if the result is instead that just mainstream parties change course and adopt new policies and otherwise become more adaptable to this era, then that's all to the better.
Chat saying mix it with the variety of different views. It's hard to have completely impartial news because people of certain professions are going to statistically be more likely to be one political alignment than another. Like, I feel like journalists are more likely to be left-leaning. Just inherently being a journalist, you're collecting information about what other people are doing, which is inherently collectivist. You're looking at the group. A lot of conservative sentiment is more individualistic, so just a hypothesis from me. Maybe there's more representation in a lot of media left-leaning because that practice is more group-oriented rather than individual-oriented. Could be a factor. Another one is education level, I think, or just being near more urban centers. I think urban people tend to be more left-leaning than right-leaning. So if it's BBC and it's in London, like, the people who are in London are more likely to be left-leaning. So just situationally, if you have a polished news thing, you're going to want, like, polished news anchors and journalists and everything, and they're going to have good credentials and education and all that kind of stuff, which is going to lead them down similar roads of bias. You can always interview people, like, that's another thing. Seeing the people who you interview and trying to balance the different personalities that you have on TV and their takes in a way that everyone gets represented, that's a really cool idea. The problem is funding stuff and getting good advertising for it is going to be stronger whenever you fit other people's agendas that they want to share. If it's a very mixed agenda, it doesn't really point toward anyone being right and anyone being wrong. In many cases, it's just, okay, everyone threw out their opinions there. That can be dry and unsatisfying for some people who are browsing media. They want to know, okay, after all of this news, what do I think about this? Because maybe you're not that invested in politics and you haven't really spent much time thinking about it. So modern media gives us that end result of not only this is what happened, this is how you think about it. And that's where a lot of the bias gets baked in. Before you have their opinion about why it happened, you just have the facts on the ground, at least as far as you can tell, of there were this many casualties or this many percentage of votes, that kind of stuff. And then people can distort it from there.
Yeah.
Having perfectly balanced news is basically impossible, but it would be a cool idea.
Pretty much. Yeah, there's no easy solution to that. Like, even if you go ahead.
I've heard from my family members who watch Fox News that they normally have a quote liberal guy or someone who represents that perspective.
Yeah.
Which that's normally a very softened angle. They're not usually a firebrand, but they are someone who's leaning in that direction, and they can kind of speak to that camp, and it creates at least the notion of some representation of the out group.
It's very superficial.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they basically just put some, sad sack guy desperate for money in the political cuck chair and then yell at him for 15 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
It's not meaningful debate.
In the hot seat. Outgroup member, why are you so wrong about all this stuff? And then they try to set it up in such a way that their side looks more intellectual and correct in the end. But it was very nice of them to bring someone on. Definitely makes them the more balanced.
Yeah, they can pretend.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of people in chat are pointing out that the Democratic Party isn't exactly progressive in its stance. It feels very status quo, very kind of establishment, just generic. The Democratic Party represents a lot of American stuff, but it doesn't really have that passionate identity that some of the candidates who have run for it have. Like Bernie Sanders is a passionate candidate. Hillary is less passionate in terms of her own issues. And the party as a whole has silenced people who aren't going to be the main winner for the running. Mm-hmm. So they try to narrow it down and then put all their support by that one person, which does give you more oomph if you can consolidate the party's will and then point it toward the front runner. Then yes, that's going to give you more momentum. But if that's a forced thing, then people are going to feel bitter about, okay, you guys didn't actually give my contender a fair shot, so I'm going to go for the alternative. And that's why they bled a lot of votes to Trump, I think, was some grumpy Bernie Sanders voters who flipped.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there was a turnout issue there for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we got a ton of YouTube comments on one of our recent world discussions. I didn't read all of them, but
I did.
You did.
Yeah, a lot of that was just one guy.
Okay.
Yeah, he was having trouble with allegedly YouTube removing his comments.
Mm-hmm.
I think he didn't see them post immediately after he hit post, and so just kept reposting the same thing over and over again.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so kind of a little bit redundant there. Yeah, You kind of got to be patient with YouTube. They don't always post immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it takes them a couple hours or even longer. I've had similar problems in the past. Yeah, so if you just spam your comment thinking it's just going to show up at some point, you're not going to get it posted in the short term, but in the long term, you're going to have like 20 posts all stacked up on each other, one after the other.
Mm-hmm.
So, probably like maybe around a third to a half of the comments on that video were that one guy.
Okay. Yeah, U.S. politics is definitely spicy for our audience.
Well, I mean, yeah, but that's always true, and we don't normally get like 60 comments, which is a lot for me anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the issue is that it's an election year.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, that's the bigger deal. I remember, I think it was 2020. No, it must have been the 2022 midterms. We were talking about politics, and we had a guy post a comment that was in all caps, and it was just basically a right-wing screed. Very much a boomer-type comment in the grand scheme of things. Yeah, so it's the election years, I think, that really bring them out.
Yeah.
If you want a little inside baseball, it's the election years that all of the think tanks and whatnot in Washington that are affiliated with one or the other party. And I'm talking more here about the advocacy outfits. I think we've talked before about the difference between advocacy think tanks and like more neutral think tanks. And they go into high gear in election years. They'll start pumping out articles, editorials, quote unquote research papers. They get very, very noisy in election year. I was just reading an article from the American Enterprise Institute the other day, with them whining about the Biden administration's export restriction policy. And mind you, I don't mind reading about that. I'm interested in that topic, but I just kind of noted that they very rarely have, published substantive editorial pieces that are as incendiary as the article that I read during non-election years, right? They'll post content about that subject in non-election years, but it's generally more academic and bland. But then all of a sudden in an election year, they've got all this fire and brimstone. They have all this invective all of a sudden for the status quo president if it's not of the right party. So that's relevant because when they go into high gear, it kind of filters downstream, right? Think tanks are think tanks and PR agencies really are at the top of the mountain. And then they produce stuff that flows down into things like cable television news, newspapers, shady online websites with unclear funding, all these sort of intermediate outlets that people kind of get their news from. And then from there, it flows even further down into the social media sphere, where somebody will post a Facebook thing using data that they heard on Fox News, which they themselves got from a think tank. So that's kind of how it works. And kind of like when a glacier melts, during the summer, during the election years, the think tanks really start pumping out more stuff, and then that floods the zone. And then not only is there more such content on the news outlets, in turn it kind of blows up on social media, and so that gets people excited, right? More people get more exposed to politics and political issues and messages during election years, and that gets them more excited, and then that results in crazed, unhinged comments on YouTube videos.
Right. So the way that I'm seeing this circle of life is the think tank is the originator of new dank stuff before stuff is going to happen, where they're making their predictions. They're also kind of doing their wish list stuff. I'm thinking Project 2025 kind of things, where people put their heads together and they list out a bunch of stuff. And then people who are next to that sphere, they're going to pass that along. And like you said, pass it to cable news eventually. And then the end user is getting these kind of filtered, selected snippets of think tank stuff. And it's something that they might not always be passionate about, but for the election, they feel like they have to research to an extent. So the think tanks have relatively more power around these big presidential elections because more eyes are on politics.
Yeah, I don't know how much impact it has on voting, but in terms of activity, it certainly has an incendiary effect. Especially given that they know how to get people excited with dramatic headlines and quote unquote findings. So, when they pump all that out, invariably there's a big reaction. And then the election happens, and then they kind of go dormant for a while. They go back to doing the actual academic stuff that they're more interested in. And that's very boring to most people. So, all of the invective online, all of the crazed comments, they don't entirely go away, but the incidence declines precipitously generally. So it's good to be involved in politics. If there is an issue that excites you, by all means, advocate, participate, vote, try to inform people, do all that stuff. But do keep in mind that there is a degree of manipulation involved as far as how you actually learn about that stuff. If you go out of your way to learn substantive issues on your own, if you want to read the literature, actual academic research, be it in the form of papers or books or what have you, about important topics, you'll learn a lot more than you will if you're just getting your news from Daily Kos or Newsmax or something like that. Right? Because the purpose of research is to inform and to contribute to a conversation that's happening in an academic community. When you write something in academia, you expect to get shit back for it. You're going to get feedback from other academics who are going to rip you a new asshole, if you do things wrong. But that isn't really what information is presented for in non-academic outlets, right? The cable TV news networks, they don't really care about feedback. They don't care if you're actually getting informed, or they're certainly not involved in like a conversation with you as a consumer.
Mm-hmm.
They're just giving you stuff that they think is going to lead you to watch their stuff more, as well as, please their donors. People who buy advertising time, people who patronize given television shows. These guys have influence, and one of the quids pro quo that they get in exchange for their support is that their preferred information gets presented. And so that information of whatever kind it may be, probably just superficial bullshit meant to excite people, that's going to get reported, quote unquote, probably on some late night news segment that isn't really even a news segment, something like Tucker Carlson back in the day. And Fox News itself said that Tucker Carlson was an entertainer, not a news anchor.
Mm-hmm.
So, that is where that kind of information generally ends up more. But because those people are more trusted, that information tends to be more impactful. And again, when I say impactful, I don't mean it's converting people. It's making people vote in a way that they weren't going to vote before. Rather, it's more designed to just get people interested in voting so that there's higher voter turnout for whatever side that they're focusing on.
Yeah. They want to make sure it's a very important vote because people's party alignment very seldom changes, I think. Like maybe there's a certain candidate that shifts their vote, but most people don't change their political alignment with an election year. They'll just be like, our candidate is weak this year. I'm going to vote for them because I hope that our side wins, but I don't care about them, kind of waiting for the next one. A lot of people feel that way for sure. Yep.
I think we had a question. Snyder versus United States ruling. Did we not talk about this? The gratuities thing?
I don't know. Gratuities.
Okay. Yeah, that was another Supreme Court ruling. Basically, the individual case in question, I'm going to try to do this from memory because I don't think I have notes on it. There was a small city where the mayor decided to take control of the process by which contracts are awarded for the collection of garbage. Mm-hmm. Did I say president? I meant mayor. The mayor of the city went out of his way to get the authority to award the contract, and then he awarded it to some guys who had a very particular type of truck. I don't remember the exact details, but basically the requirements to win the contract were changed such that pretty much just the one company was even eligible to try to get the contract. So invariably they won. Mm-hmm. And I think like a couple months later, or maybe a year later, the mayor came to the owners of that company and said, "Hey, I'm having money trouble. Would you be willing to help out?" And then they gave him some money. And so the suspicion was that that was a reward for granting them the contract, effectively bribery. And so a lawsuit resulted, and it came before the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said that, no, that's not a bribe, that's a gratuity. It's perfectly okay for people who win a contract to show their appreciation for a given politician by giving them some money. So that led to a lot of people on social media saying, oh, so bribery is legal now. And to that I would say, no, it's just not. I mean, certainly the bar is a little higher in order to prosecute bribery, but for the most part, bribery is no more or less legal than it was before. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the issue with bribery is that you really have to establish the quid pro quo. Can you prove that this politician took action X in exchange for Y amount of money?
Yeah, you have to point to where it changed their behavior.
Yeah.
In a way that the money paid for it.
Yeah.
Right.
And then you have to also show that the money that changed hands was specifically with regard to that action. Mm-hmm. So in this case, the contractors say, no, we weren't giving him money as a reward for the contract. We were just giving him money to help him out because we like him. Which is probably bullshit. Like, you've got to think 90% chance that there was corruption going on there. But the issue is that you just can't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Mm-hmm. So therein lies the rub. Now, you could change the law and say that actually, yes, even if this kind of thing is not a clear-cut case of bribery, we should still be able to convict him for something just to discourage politicians and contractors from pussyfooting around like this. I was talking before about norms. Another norm is that because it's inherently difficult to police things like bribery among elected officials, it kind of behooves elected officials, as well as the stability of the overall political system, if they go out of their way to not do stuff like that, specifically so they're never in a position in the first place where the actions they take and the money they receive could be construed as a bribe. Again, this accounts for even situations where no bribery took place at all. Again, the idea of the norm is to avoid looking like there was any bribery and avoiding any situation where it could even be possibly perceived as bribery. That's difficult. Sometimes it's unavoidable, probably, but in general, that's the norm that you're supposed to respect in public office. And some guys don't give a shit. And so then they force prosecutors into a position where they have to try to prove it, and sometimes they can't, and they get away with it. And then they by extension, put voters in the awkward position of having to make a judgment call about whether or not this behavior should be considered bribery or not. Again, without substantive proof without definitive proof, one way or the other, that it was or wasn't. So that's how you introduce instability into a system, because at that point it really comes down to faith, trust, and those kinds of things vary significantly from person to person depending on political biases. So from an individual perspective, from the personal interest of the elected politician in question, this is all to their benefit, right? They can exploit this ambiguity greatly to make a lot of money, off of the process of government procurement. But it's not good for the political system, and in the long run, it's self-defeating because it just undermines faith in the system and introduces more and more corruption over time. So the Supreme Court in this regard is not wrong in their judgment. Like a lot of things the Supreme Court rules on, their judgment makes sense from a perspective. The criticism is just more that they're making bribery easier, not harder. And that's not good. They're not making it any easier to hold politicians to account, and that's not helpful. So to be fair to the Supreme Court justices, I'm sure their counter argument to that would be, well, that's not our responsibility. It's Congress's responsibility. They should pass a law, lowering the bar for prosecuting bribery if that's something they're concerned about. And of course, then the counter argument to that would be that Congress is deadlocked and can't do anything. And they need, the Supreme Court and the executive and other branches of government to pick up the slack. And then that leads to the counter-argument in turn that that's a road to tyranny. Like, you can't just give the executive and the judicial branch that kind of authority and expect them not to abuse the shit out of it. So their answer is that Congress needs to, nut up basically and do their fucking job, which is to legislate. And that other branches of government should not be expected to take up the slack because that's just going to undermine the integrity of the whole political system. The imperial presidency is not a good development as far as the health of the U.S. political system, right? That's a long-running phenomenon now, and it has not done any favors to the political system. And, the judiciary hasn't been in the doghouse for as long as the executive in that regard. But certainly you can see, given all the criticism of the Supreme Court, why handing them more power, not less, is not going to be a viable solution to that. But then how do you get a Congress that actually does, in fact, cooperate and become productive again? That just gets you back to square one. So no easy solutions. Once again, lots of unsatisfying answers today. But we don't strive for satisfying answers. We strive for something resembling accurate answers, accurate portrayals of the reality of institutions. And so that's where we're at.
There was one mention of a bribery case where they got somebody in U.S. history. Does the name Rod Blagojevich ring a bell?
Rod Blagojevich. Yes, he was the guy that tried to sell the governorship?
Yes. I think it was Barack Obama's senator seat when he got president.
Oh, the Senate seat. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, chat mentioned this person. I hadn't heard of this. But they, I think, ran for state legislature, or they were in state legislature in Illinois, and the, I guess, federal, so they were a senator as well, or House of Representatives, and then got governor. And then when Obama goes and gets president, he tries to sell the Senate seat. And he got 14 years in federal prison, and Trump let him out after 8.
That sounds like something what Trump would do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I remember the Blagovich thing back in the day. It's been a while.
I don't remember that.
It was stupid. That was like an overt example of explicit corruption and bribery.
How did he put this up for sale?
I think the way, honestly, it's been too long. I think it was something like selling support, because obviously you can't just give the seat to somebody, right? Or at least I don't think you can. So I think he was saying that, if he was paid a certain sum, then he would put his political machine behind whoever paid him, which in Illinois can be very beneficial. But I can't say for sure that's what it was, because again, I don't remember exactly. I'll throw out the usual disclaimer here. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. More painfully obvious at sometimes than others. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later, so I will get the feedback. And I do enjoy the feedback, even if it's in the form of long reposted screeds on YouTube.
Chat saying that, what is his name? Blagojevich could give the seat because the governor had the power to assign a person if the senator had to leave during their term. So it was a special governor power.
There you go. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, in that case, I could totally see how you could sell it. That makes sense.
If you could sell it and get away with it, that would probably be a lot of money because political influence is fairly valuable. But if you get caught, you go in jail. So it's a gamble.
Well, Illinois and especially Chicago are kind of known for corrupt politics, so maybe no surprise. It's kind of embedded in the culture in some places. Mm-hmm. And he probably had engaged in corruption before and gotten away with it. Mm-hmm. So, you get away with it enough times, you kind of take for granted that you can do it again.
Yeah. You feel like you can outsmart all of them. It's interesting, the risk level stacks up pretty high for stuff like this. Because 14 years prison for bribery, I think, is pretty hard to get. Like, you have to be in a pretty powerful position to be bribed to the extent that it's that big of a crime.
14 years?
It seems like a lot of jail time for not hurting anybody. You're receiving money and doing stuff.
Well, you want a lot of jail time for that, because, you want politicians to be impartial and to not abuse the authority of their office, and that's a very clear-cut abuse. When corruption gets embedded, it's very, very difficult to uproot. So you really want to clamp down on it whenever you can find it. And if you can't find it very often, despite it happening with some frequency, that just means you need to go even harder on the people you do catch. Mm-hmm. So long, hefty jail times for people engaging in very explicit, obvious, stupidly explicit corruption, that does make sense. Mm-hmm. That is how you want to deal with that. Keep in mind, we're talking big money. The higher the level of the office, the more money that you can make by abusing it. So, if you just give people like $100,000 fine and a couple years in prison, that's not going to deter anybody.
Yeah.
You're going to have to go much harder than that. Given how much money that they stand to win by being corrupt, you really got to offset that with some correspondingly hefty punishments.
Yeah, because if they had more money than that, they might even take that trade if the punishment is weak enough.
Exactly.
That makes sense. Huh. Yeah, it's interesting, too, how the norms of corruption are so important, because if being corrupt is seen as cool and like you getting your piece of the pie, then everyone around you is taking those deals. So none of the options, politically speaking, or for any role, are actually like upstanding, lawful good options. They're all going to be mysteriously vanishing parts of value that would go to the people as a whole that they're taking for themselves, or they're passing along to someone else after taking some for themselves.
Yeah.
What are the least corrupt countries right now?
Well, keeping in mind that's not a very high bar. I don't know. I'd have to look it up, honestly.
They probably have some kind of metric for gauging that.
Well, Transparency International tries to. Corruption Perceptions Index. So number 1 on their ranking is Denmark.
Mm-hmm.
And then Finland, New Zealand, Norway, Singapore, Sweden. Singapore? Really? Sweden, Switzerland, Netherlands, Germany. So basically a lot of Germanic type countries.
Mm-hmm.
And then Switzerland.
Small developed countries that are relatively rich.
Yeah. Ireland, really. Let's see. Luxembourg, Hong Kong. Hong Kong shouldn't even be on the list.
How is Hong Kong corrupt?
I mean,
or is not a
it's
country?
a de facto one-party state at this point, right? So yeah, as far as corruption goes, that's pretty corrupt. But I guess they're focusing more on things like economic corruption, bribery and stuff like that. Where's the U.S.? 24. We're ranked 24th.
Okay. Top 25.
That's out of 180, so not too bad.
That's pretty bad, though, for how high we score in other categories.
Well, keep in mind, there's a lot of variance. Given how big the U.S. is, there's definitely regions where it's worse than others.
Mm-hmm.
Throw in the South, for example. Yeah, that's almost certainly weighing down the average.
Mm-hmm. What are the most corrupt countries?
I mean, it's going to be like sub-Saharan Africa, right? Last place, 180th, Somalia.
Okay, pirates.
I mean, Somalia doesn't even have a government, though, really. So I don't see how they can really even be on the list. I mean, really, if you have no government, shouldn't you have no corruption then?
Hey.
Let's see. After that, Somalia, Syria, South Sudan, Venezuela, Yemen, North Korea, that makes sense, Libya, Haiti, Equatorial. I'm noticing a lot of failed states here.
Mm-hmm.
Failed states or failing states. So I guess those are the most corrupt, so to speak.
What prevents the U.S. from scoring higher on that? What are we doing?
Let's see. Let's see what Transparency International has to say. Let's see. I'm guessing partisanship is generally mentioned in lists like these. Imperial presidency, Congress being overly deferential. Oh, do they just not have it listed here? Yeah, they're not detailing what's behind their score.
It's not very transparent of them.
Well, fair point. It must be somewhere on their website, but I'm not seeing it here. Yeah. No, I don't want to dwell on it too much.
That's okay.
If anybody's interested, that's Transparency International's website, and it's their Corruption Perceptions Index.
Which is decided by some means. Unbeknownst to us. Well, cool. If there hasn't been that much more news, if you want to hit up some BG3 for a bit, we could make a bit of progress. I'm in a game right now, but after...
I do enjoy the Rage Barbarian.
Yeah, throwing stuff.
Throwing. You know, I did not realize the Rage Throw resulted in a guaranteed proning of the target.
It's a very good ability.
Yeah. It gets even better, though, because I relearned something I'd forgotten before, which is that if you get somebody wet and then hit them with cold or electrical damage, it does double damage.
Huh.
And I've been running that, and my latest run is a Cryomancer build, so I'm doing a bunch of ice damage. And I was kind of bored with it for a while, but then last week I rediscovered that fact that I just totally forgotten about, and it's a lot more fun now. You can do a shit ton of damage, so long as you use water correctly.
Cool.
So that's been a lot of fun. There's also oil. If you can get oil on a target, then fire damage does double damage. But oil's a little harder to find, in my experience. Water, by contrast, is fucking everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, I used void bulbs. So what I'll do is I'll use a void bulb, then I'll throw the water, like a glass of water or something, and then it gets everybody in the area wet, and then I drop one of those, like a ice knife or ice fall or whatever, just some area of effect ice spell, and then it'll just do a shit ton of damage. And I've got a bunch of buffs on the Cryomancer for ice damage and elemental damage, so you know she's especially effective.
Nice.
Yeah, I just about wiped out the Githyanki Crash doing that readily. Easily the easiest time I've had of doing that.
Sweet. Did we fight the Crush yet together?
Oh no, we're nowhere near.
Okay.
We're still like level 5 or 4, and I think we just entered the Spider Cave. So I think that's about where we are. So we're still pretty early in Act 1 overall.
Oh, yeah. Spider Cave is like the very first foray into the
Underdark, yeah.
Well, appreciate chat keeping it together today as well. I know politics can sometimes be pretty inflammatory, but it hasn't been too bad. I don't think anyone's gotten in big trouble yet.
Yeah, there's always time.
Yeah.
Let's see, since you're in a StarCraft game, there was a little bit of Hong Kong in the news. This was a couple weeks ago. So, are you familiar? This is, I guess, kind of a dumb question, but you know, are you familiar with Hong Kong's judicial system?
I don't think so.
So, because it was a British territory for a long time, they have a British-style judicial system. You know, same kinds of courts and whatnot, and you know they work pretty well, right? You know, they're comparable to Western judicial systems. But the problem they had before the handover, when Britain gave Hong Kong back to China, is that you know, they had never given Hong Kong its own high court. You know, basically the British equivalent of a Supreme Court, right? The high court in Hong Kong was basically just the high court in the UK. So if anybody wanted to appeal something to the highest possible court, they would end up in London. So that was a problem for the handover, because of course China doesn't want the highest court in Hong Kong to be in another country. So they talked about it before the handover, and so what the British ended up doing is creating a new high court specifically for Hong Kong. And they appointed 3 judges to that highest court, a court of appeal, and to act as like the new high court. after the handover happened. And that had been the case for much of the past 30 some years, you know. Now, the other interesting thing about the judicial system in Britain is that because it was a British territory, there's a whole bunch of judges in Hong Kong's judicial system who are not Chinese, right? If you were a British citizen, then you could go be a judge in that system. And so there's actually, even today, British judges serving in Hong Kong.
Really? Huh.
Yeah. So they held on to them, and, you know, China was willing to accept that because even the communists in China recognize that rule of law does have some value, and Hong Kong had that. So they decided to allow that to continue. Now, if you've been following Hong Kong, as we did, then you know that the new national security law that the mainland imposed on Hong Kong has somewhat curbed the rule of law in Hong Kong. You know, they've still left the infrastructure of rule of law in place. Like, the courts are all there. All the people who work in the courts are still there. Like, it nominally still works the same as before. But what's different is that with the national security law in place, the executive has way broader discretion in who it can bring cases against and the bar it has to clear to successfully prosecute them and what's the word I want? Indict them. No, not indict. Whatever. Put them in prison. The bar for that is much lower. And a lot of judges in the judicial system were uncomfortable with that. So what the mainland did in order to appease them is to say that the new rules would be used in a relatively limited fashion. And if they did use them, they would not use them to overturn court rulings. Because what could happen, hypothetically, is that the executive in Hong Kong could use the national security law to arrest, you know, political dissidents or whatever. And according to the law, you know, the laws in Hong Kong anyway, the dissidents in question could hypothetically appeal that ruling. And again, hypothetically, eventually that case could end up before the high court, and that high court could rule against the government. And what concerned the judges is a provision in the national security law that basically could allow the government to overturn a court ruling like that. Again, hypothetical, like it hasn't actually happened, but hypothetically it could. Now, what happened a month or so ago is that it had become sufficiently clear that the executive of Hong Kong, in conjunction with the mainland Chinese government, was not actually honoring those promises, that they were not, in fact, being discreet and, well, not discreet. They were not implementing the law in a narrow, focused fashion. It was instead like being used as a bludgeon against opposition and dissidents. And that being the case, the judges, well, specifically judges on the High Court, no longer had faith that the executive was going to, in the hypothetical scenario that a high court ruled against them, that the executive would not then overturn the ruling using the national security law. Now, technically, that would be legal under the law, but again, the judges in question had effectively been promised that that would not happen. And what happened with the judges is that they, 3 specifically British judges serving on the high court, resigned, stating that they no longer had faith that the executive was going to respect the rule of law, and specifically rulings that they made as court justices on the high court. Now, the fact that they were British judges and not Chinese meant that there was room for the Chinese government to kind of just write it off as foreign interference. They were saying that, you know, the judges were influenced or maybe even bribed by hostile governments that were trying to undermine the people's faith in their government in Hong Kong. So, you know, the usual propaganda you would expect.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, I just thought it was interesting that, 1, there were still British judges in Hong Kong's judiciary, and 2, that they had actually believed, or at least pretended to believe, that the government would not abuse that law, and that it took this long for them to finally just kind of see that that was not going to be the case, and finally to eventually just resign in protest. Now, I would point out this doesn't change anything, right? You know, new justices are just going to be promoted to take their place. I don't know if they'll be British or not, but certainly they're probably going to be a little more amenable to the government's position on the issue. So, nothing's going to change in that regard. And really, justices resigning isn't going to have any impact on broader society either, because, again, the national security law is being used to suppress dissent. So, it's not like you can go out and protest in solidarity with the judge or anything. But yeah, just an interesting side note in the continuing devolution of Hong Kong's political system.
Yeah, it's kind of a slow assimilation, it seems like, because Hong Kong had a lot of independence for reasons, and that's kind of being eroded in a non-violent way, but in a very direct way.
Yeah.
Control is being imposed, and they have some of their traditions, and they are being taken away. Not all at once, but piecemeal, I guess.
Yeah, they're not doing it like in dramatic fashion. It's kind of boiling the frog. Although in this case, the frog was well aware. I think you remember all the big protests in Hong Kong in 2019.
Yeah. Yeah, they were actually rated as some of the more effective protesters in terms of integrating with professionals and working people and stuff and having a clear action plan, a set of demands. Like, it was much more organized than a lot of groups of people yelling at stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, they did good work. The trouble is that they were just up against a block monolith. Even the most effective protest movements are not going to be effective if the government just decides to ignore you and go full authoritarian, which in effect is what happened. Yeah, protesting isn't enough in and of itself. We've talked ad nauseum about that before, but it's always worth repeating. Like, protests have to be part of a broader movement, have to be part of organization in order to really be effective. Otherwise, any changes that come out of it are just going to be fleeting and superficial. Politicians will pacify you if you protest hard, but any actual substantive concessions can only be won through structural change. And you're going to need organization as well as the connivance of elites in the pre-existing system to make that happen, all of which is very difficult.
Well, appreciate you breaking it down for us. Chat, thanks for being here today. It's a lot more relaxing. Cheers. It's more relaxing streaming post-subathon because we don't have a timer running of maybe the stream is going to end, maybe it's going to survive. We lived the whole month, though, so it was a very epic run. Very grateful to all the community for making it happen. And we've had a more relaxing first few streams coming back. Kind of playing what I want to and at a more relaxed pace. I do have some of the goals and things that I will go through. We have a StarCraft 1 campaign that I need to play through. I'll play Oblivion, the Elder Scrolls game, just for a nostalgia dip in that one. I remember really enjoying Oblivion when I played it originally. It was like one of those mind-blowing, really revolutionary graphics upgrades from Morrowind to Oblivion that surprised a lot of people, so I'll play that one. And Dota All Hero Challenge is another one. It's an in-game feature where it challenges you to win a match in unranked or ranked with the hero, and then you advance to the next one. So some of the heroes are more casters, some of them are more melee, all the different archetypes and that kind of thing. And some of them are fairly complicated in that you have to control multiple units at the same time. So those heroes I've had a relatively easier shot with because it boosts my power rather than makes it harder for me as a StarCraft player. Because we're used to tabbing through stuff of different control groups or things on the same control group, some higher priority, some lower priority. All of that stuff is practiced every single StarCraft game. Whereas in Dota, a lot of people might just be used to controlling one unit, and then you have a multi-unit hero that can raise the complexity. But All Hero Challenge has been really cool. I tend to get stuck in a rut of picking Drow Ranger and the like. So sometimes it's good to play a big scary monster character because they're technically better for the draft. And doing the All Hero Challenge gets me out of my comfort zone, gets me to try new things, which is great. Well, cool. I think we can put a pin in this here for some world discussion with Agent Smith.
Thanks for having me on. Much appreciated.
We'll see you on the next one.